Hey everybody, welcome back to another review, and this time we are talking about the final set of issues for Kurt Busiek's Iron Man run. This time we're talking about issues 18 through 25 and a host of others that you saw in the introduction to this video. There's a lot that we're covering, and I'm gonna try and talk about it as generally as possible without going through every single issue, because that would just take forever, and I don't feel like there's enough material here in order to warrant that. So we'll break it up into a few sections, and the first one's going to be the story arc here titled Machinery of War, which is the thing it's the story arc that wraps up the War Machine subplot that we've been dealing with in the previous few issues, which, by the way, for a story about War Machine, Machinery of War is the worst title ever. It's the least creative thing you could possibly do. I have no idea why they chose that title of all things. So Machinery of War is basically just Sunset Bane getting Tony Stark to work for her company, and in doing that, you realize that her plan all along was to have Tony help her get control of Jocasta. And while he does that, he figures out what's going on, and so while he tries to escape and he gets his Iron Man armor on, War Machine shows up, and the War Machine that we've been dealing with in these previous few issues, and he's got a bit of an upgrade, and we find out after Rhodey spent all this time searching for who he thinks the real War Machine is, we find out his name is someone called Parnell, and he's got a wife that Rhodey introduced him to, and both him and Rhodey worked together in the war. He's the guy that got Rhodey into being a mercenary, so he's got a pretty extensive military history, and he's got a bit of history with Rhodey. And what we have here is we have that guy and one of his friends upgrading the War Machine armor, so it looks really bulky and really bad and really 90s, and he attacks Tony in his Iron Man armor while Tony is trying to get Jocasta to be freed. And so the story arc ultimately ends up being kind of anticlimactic because it never really coalesces into anything legitimately interesting. There's nothing about this conflict between War Machine and Tony that's really resonating to the core of those characters. The history between Parnell and Rhodey's all recapped in one issue, and we barely get to know that guy anyway, and so that conflict's a little bit anticlimactic as well. The thing with his wife is just kind of added melodrama, and then the thing that we get afterwards, which is the stuff with Jocasta, is not really that interesting. Jocasta kind of becomes the comic book equivalent of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's version of Jarvis, where she's basically just like running things in Tony's lab now. Essentially, Tony's able to free her, but he isn't able to get the files from Sunset Bane that prove that she's a criminal. And so Tony puts her up in one of his computers, and he offers to build her a new body. And she says no, she kind of likes it here. And so she just kind of ends up like running Tony Stark's laboratory, and so you kind of get the Iron Man movie thing of him like having a conversation with an AI that's kind of got a bit of personality to it, and so that's fine, that's interesting. And Kurt Busiek's talked a little bit about how the Iron Man movies have borrowed from him, and how like the Avengers, Tony's armor at the final battle is basically the same kind of pod thing that we get in the safe armor that Busiek developed, and Jocasta being very similar to what Jarvis would do later. It's like little superficial things that Busiek's run was used for in as far as Marvel Cinematic Universe is concerned. And so the conflict with Parnell's War Machine basically boils down to Rhodey saying, keep Tony Stark alive because you owe me a favor. And Parnell's like, okay, cool, and then he leaves. And it's probably the dumbest ending you could have possibly had to that story arc, along with one of the dumbest titles for that possible story arc. There's a little bit of stuff developed in that particular arc in relation to Carol Danvers. We don't do a whole lot with her per se yet. Some of that comes back later. We deal a little bit more with like Tony's addictions and stuff. And so during a couple of these issues where there's a fight scene here and there, you see Carol Danvers showing up and she's drunk, and she's kind of almost got like two personalities, where she's the sober, apologetic, recovering alcoholic, and then she's like in alcoholic blackouts, which is really interesting. So you have an entire issue dealing with Iron Man trying to help her in a fight, but in doing so, while she's drunk, you just kind of end up having her endanger more and more people. And this is stuff that's, again, been building through both Busiek's Avengers work and here. And so Machinery of War touches on that a little bit, but it's not really the main focus of that book. We have a little bit more of people comparing Tony Stark to James Bond, which has been a classic thing throughout all of this. And so after that story arc ends, we get to a annual issue, which basically wraps up some of the stuff that we had earlier with the first issue and the Death Squad that's been attacking Tony Stark. And so the annual is basically just an oversized issue that brings in a government agent that Tony works with to help figure out the guy that's been attacking him all this time. And so he goes through like this giant process of fighting through death squadrons and stuff to get to the lair of the person that's been attacking him, because we noticed in Revenge of the Mandarin that Mandarin was only responsible for half of his coordinated attacks. And the other half, turns out, comes from Count Nefario, who, I think that's the name, Count Nefario, the guy that's the father of Madame Mask, Whitney Frost, the guy that we thought died right before Michelini and Leighton took over, the person that was like rapidly aging and such, and he hasn't been really around for a while, and now he's kind of got like this vampiric thing going where like he takes like ionic energy and is able to like sustain his power. They don't end up capturing him by the end, because despite Tony being able to defeat him, what happens is the government of that area decides to let him go, and so his plot thread's kind of not finished. And the whole revelation as to what he's doing and where he's coming from and why he's attacking Tony just basically boils down to that old classic Iron Man stuff of Tony's involvement in his original death. And then, again, this proves to be a little bit anticlimactic, which is sort of the word of the day when it comes to these last set of issues. Basically, from 18 to 25, Kurt Busiek is co-plotting with Roger Stern, and Roger Stern's writing all the dialogue. And they would do the reverse later in Avengers Forever, where Kurt Busiek and Roger Stern are co-plotting, but Busiek's writing all the dialogue. And basically what's happening with Busiek, as far as I can read from interviews and stuff, is that he was actually getting kind of sick at this point, and he was stretching himself too thin, doing way too many books. And so Iron Man just kind of had to go, despite him trying to do some interesting things, coalescing the four identities of Tony Stark, as he puts it. And so most of this ending feels kind of rushed and kind of anticlimactic, particularly because half of the ongoing plot is resolved in an annual issue as opposed to within the pages of its own book. And so after that, we get into what's arguably the worst story of Busiek's tenure, which is something titled The Eighth Day. The Eighth Day is basically this big crossover event kind of thing that goes from Iron Man 21 to 22, I think, and then Peter Parker Spider-Man number 11, Thor number 17, and then a Juggernaut issue titled The Eighth Day. And essentially what this is, if you remember back in the day with Juggernaut's more mystical origin, that actually gets tied into something like with these mystical temples, and apparently Juggernaut gets his power from this group of 8 gods that like created 8 different idols, and now a spell's been activated that's forcing other humans to interact with these other 7 idols, while Juggernaut's the first one, and they're trying to like prove who is the strongest among them by having humans harness their power and go at each other, one of them being Juggernaut and a lot of the others kind of just being filler characters and stuff. And it's kind of the most pointless thing ever. Professor Xavier's roped into this somehow. There's a whole bunch of stuff with Thor and Iron Man, and then Peter Parker showing up and trying to deal with this stuff. The highlight of it is the Howard Mackie, John Romita Jr.'s Peter Parker Spider-Man. I didn't know that was actually a book. I know Howard Mackie wrote Spider-Man for a while. I didn't know he had that book. And so that issue is actually kind of fun and interesting, and I kind of want to go back and read some of that. But the story itself is really weak and kind of amounts to nothing. There are a lot of people that are kind of antagonistic towards Tony Stark in that story for no real reason. They have a fundamental misconception of who Tony Stark is, and then they use that fundamental misconception to be a jerk to him throughout the whole story, and I don't really understand why that was needed. Particularly when we're using this book to focus more so on Tony changing and growing as a person and such. And Busiek talks about this idea that Tony Stark for him is both the businessman, the ladies' man, the inventor, and the superhero. And he's been deconstructing all of those sides rather interestingly, and we'll talk about the business side a little bit later. We talked about the superhero side with Iron Man being, with Tony being addicted to the armor. The ladies' man stuff is sort of discussed last time when we talked about his relationship with his new girlfriend. That's not really here much. And then the inventor side is part of the armor arc with the whole creating the safe armor and all of that. And so that's interesting. And then by this point, the only thing we haven't really dealt with is made him understand he's addicted to the armor, and we haven't really dealt with the business side of it. And so you would think that this would be more of like a classic Iron Man superhero adventure, and it's kind of not. It's just sort of bland, and not a lot happens in it. You could probably skip through all of those issues and not really miss anything, which is part of the shame. And then another plot point introduced in the middle of both the Eighth Day and the Machinery of War and the annual stuff, which is before we set up that Madame Mask had been shot and killed, and Tony identified her body, and now another woman's turned up, almost in pretty close to the same location. It's exactly the same person, shot and killed in exactly the same way. So there are two Madame Masks, and that never gets wrapped up, at least not in this set of issues. And then right after this, Joe Quesada takes over on the book, and so we'll talk about that stuff later. So after the Eighth Day, which is just kind of awful, we go on to the final arc here, which has to do with Ultimo. And here we're wrapping up some of the stuff between Pepper, Happy, and Tony, and we're dealing more with the relationship addiction stuff. And Tony admits that he is a bit addicted to the armor, and he realizes that is he simply making excuses to get himself into the suit. And so we kind of finalize the Pepper-Tony relationship stuff here, where where her and Tony have a kiss, and in that moment they kind of realize, yeah, we're just friends, this is not going to go anywhere. And it's a really nice, tender moment, but they use it for some bad melodrama by having Happy Hogan conveniently walk in on both times that they've kissed for no good reason. And so it just kind of creates like this convenient false drama between the three that I wasn't really a fan of to begin with. And I like that they come to the understanding at the end of that Tony and Pepper aren't really a couple, they're just friends, and I enjoy that status quo for as long as it lasts. So that's kind of awkward, but it does get us to the end here where with Carol Danvers and with Ultimo, and with Ultimo, it's basically wrapping up some of the Carol Danvers stuff by having a couple of villains that she was fighting turn out to be finding parts to get back to their world so they can save one of their species. And in doing so, they've run into Ultimo, who was responsible for the eradication of one of their species. And so when Ultimo is activated by Morgan Stark, he starts to run amok and tries to attack those last surviving two characters, and Carol's kind of drunk and she doesn't really understand what's going on, and Tony has to knock her out, and he's trying to convince her constantly to go to AA meetings. And she just doesn't have any of that, and she makes this very strong case where she's always been on her own, and she wants everything to be on her own. And we kind of do a parallel thing between her and Jocasta, where Jocasta needs other people and understands her dependency on others, and Carol's on the exact opposite extreme, where she can't fathom the idea of someone coming to help her. And so she sobers up a little bit in the Ultima fight, and she realizes what she's been through and how she has to make it up to the Avengers for what she's done, particularly while drunk, and how she has a fight with Tony that results in Tony flying through the wing of a jumbo jet, and they both have to stop and rescue the plane. And we parallel the thing from Tony's Dennis O'Neil days, where Tony gets the news that if he has one more drink, he'll die. And that's the kind of thing that sort of shocks him back into not drinking. And Carol has the exact same moment here after she wakes up in the hospital after having an alcoholic blackout, and the doctor tells her that if you have one more drink, you'll die. And so she kind of has the same sort of instinct and motivation to not drink as Tony does, and you see a really interesting reflection of those two characters together. And I really like them together. I really like how Busiek's able to write all of that. And the Ultimo story just kind of serves as making amends on her part, even though it doesn't really wrap up all of the stuff Busiek was really doing. And so that covers that. And then finally, the run itself in this omnibus wrap-up in this 2-issue story called The Iron Age. which is just a mini. It's not part of the actual ongoing. The actual ongoing, the actual Kurt Busiek ongoing ended with 25, and then Quesada took over with 26. This was just 2 issues that came later, and the first issue is told entirely from Pepper's perspective of when Tony Stark first came back from being captured and became Iron Man, and then the second issue is told with the same setting entirely from Happy Hogan's perspective. And we're kind of building their relationship again, because at the end of the Tony Pepper stuff, Happy and Pepper say that they could go out and have a dinner together again, and they kind of forgive each other for the drama they've been going through. And then that issue, those 2 issues of the Iron Age, end with Happy asking Pepper out and Pepper saying no. And so you kind of get to see the start of their relationship with the end of Busiek's run, and the end of their relationship with the beginning of Busiek's run. And it's a cool parallel. The idea is really interesting, because we do focus more on the business side, and we do focus more on Tony as a gamesman, and Tony as wanting to invent and wanting to be creative, and not wanting to be shackled behind a desk and by board meetings and such. And it's a really interesting way to talk more about the business side of Stark Industries, which is something that's been diminished considerably over the years. But I really like that we get like all the intricacies, and we get like Pepper going to college and getting her business degree in the middle of the night, and everything with like people not having faith in Stark Industries after Tony's father dying, and Tony trying to figure out who he wants to be, and every time Tony disappears, or the more Tony becomes reclusive, the more Iron Man comes into the spotlight, and that kind of stuff is really interesting. It tries to retroactively incorporate more of Morgan Stark in, who's a character we only started seeing in this decade of the 90s, and the Iron Age tries to make the case that him and Tony have known each other forever, and have been working together, or have been talking to each other ever since Tony became Iron Man, which we know isn't the case, and is kind of going against what Morgan's introduction was supposed to mean in Kaminsky's run. But that's okay. It's kind of just trying to give Tony more of a supporting cast, and he's not a great character, but I'm willing to give him more time anyway. The problem with the Iron Age, though, is it kind of amounts to little to nothing. Tony's not really the main character, but you do some really, really interesting stuff by having people analyze what they see him as. The problem is that it's a little bit too long and it's a little bit too wordy, and I feel like the book is analyzing itself too much, where Pepper and Happy's monologues on every page start with describing events and then end with interpreting what these events mean because they're reminiscing and they understand what this meant in the long run. And so they don't really feel like natural characters, and doesn't really feel like a natural flashback. It just sort of feels like an arbitrary device in order to retell Iron Man's origin. And I'm not really a fan of that. And again, if you don't like Busiek's writing already, then you won't like these issues either, because they're even more Golden Age wordy, and I just don't really... It's really hard for me to get into that particular set of issues, despite me liking Busiek overall. So this particular wave isn't very good. Busiek does not go out on a high note. He really doesn't. Which is a shame. I kind of wish we got more dealing with the Carol Danvers Tony stuff. I wish we wrapped up the Madame Mask stuff here. I wish the stuff with the Second War Machine and the stuff with Count Nefario, where it was more integral to Tony as a person, as opposed to just kind of being anticlimactic ways to wrap up the arcs. And I wish the Mandarin came back. The Revenge of the Mandarin ended with this foreboding notion of clearly he intended to lose here and he was just having fun and he's going to come back, and he doesn't. And that's a real shame. So, yeah, not the best way to end this. This is a really good collection. This is a really good run on Iron Man. What's interesting, though, is Busiek says that part of the reason he wanted to write Iron Man is because he's the worst person for the job, because he's a really big fan of Iron Man. And so his book would eventually have just become like him fanboying out over old moments that he misses, which was interesting. And his big thing was he saw a lot of potential in individual plot points and historical precedent in Iron Man that was only partially explored, and so he wanted to bring that out more to the forefront. And ironically, his run I would describe as having lots of interesting potential that's only partially brought to the forefront. The way he describes Iron Man history is exactly how I would describe his run, and I really like some of it. I really like the idea of the armor being an addictive substance, the armor being bad for his health, the idea behind the safe armor. I really like Happy Hogan becoming part of the Maria Stark Foundation and liaison to Seattle and helping youth centers and stuff. I like Pepper and Tony acknowledging that they are just friends, and that they don't need a romantic relationship in order to care about each other and to have interesting character dynamics. I like all this stuff with Carol Danvers recovering from alcoholism. The stories, and I like the Mandarin stuff, and I like the Tony being under constant threat thing and his paranoia and him wanting to create something new with Stark solutions. The problem is all of it just kind of ends badly. And I wish we could have gone back and maybe reworked some of these last issues so it's not like 4 separate things between the Iron Age, the Annual, the Machinery of War stuff, and the Ultimo stuff. I really wish we could have taken those 4 segments and just turned it into one long story arc that kind of brought everything together, as opposed to just kind of sporadically trying to cap off loose plot points. And even then, missing some with the Madam Mask stuff. So this is good, but this particular wave, this ending, is not. I'd still recommend going out and buying Busiek's run. I really think that there's some stuff worth looking into here. I just think it ends on a bad note, and if you're going to buy this particular omnibus, be prepared for that. So yeah, that's what I think. Thanks everybody for watching. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said, and I'll see you next time with another review.